Today we are going to talk about Korean religions such as Confucianism, Buddhism, and Shamanism. We dealt with Christianity in the previous lecture, and in our lecture today, I will begin by talking about Confucianism, which is the most influential religion on Korean daily life, and then Buddhism, the center of the Korean religious culture. The last but not least, we are going to study Korean shamanism, finding the roots of Korean culture. Let us begin. Koreans are part of Confucianism, whether they realize it or not. This does not mean that they go around saying that they are Confucianists. Koreans nowadays accept Confucianism not as a religion, but as an ethical standard. When asked, is your religion Confucianism? Then most people will say no. But if the question is changed to, do you practice Confucianist ideas, such as being devoted to your parents? Then most of Koreans will say yes. Most young Koreans do not like Confucianism because of its strong patriarchal aspects, which suggest gender discrimination. The young generation often argues that Confucianism is obsolete and has no connection with them. If you peer into their lives, however, you will find much Confucian influence. Respecting elders and using terms like hyung, which means elder brother, or nuna, which means older sister, are evidence. Even if they ignore all other Confucian ideas, their devotion to their parents is almost absolute. The reason behind the almost absolute influence of Confucianism in Koreans' daily lives can be found in the historical text. As China's kingdom changed from the Mongolian Yuan to Han's Ming, the religious beliefs of the Chinese people also changed from the Buddhism to Confucianism. As Buddhism was a foreign belief, it was not suitable to form the basis of China's governing ideology. As China's religious ideology changed, Joseon, following China's suit, also changed its governing ideology. Therefore, Confucianism was the inevitable ideology chosen by Joseon statesmen as they found a new nation. Joseon's Confucianism can be seen as an extension of Juche's Neo-Confucian school of principle. Joseon scholars thought of Juche's ideas as the highest wisdom and defied those who criticized or dismissed those ideas as pagans. Juche explained everything with two elements such as principle and vital energy, which are Li and Qi, putting more emphasis on the former. He was also successful in making his teachings into dogmatic doctrine, putting a focus on existence of unchangeable truth, which is Li. For example, Juche said that devotion to one's parents and loyalties to one's husband were unchangeable practices written in the heavens, which no one was allowed to disobey. Joseon Confucianists did not maintain wholly different theories from those of China, as they accepted Juche's ideas unconditionally with quite few exceptions. I believe that the characteristics of Joseon Confucianism can be summed up in two words: simplicity and thoroughness. Actually, I adopted these two terms from the argument of an authority on Korean Confucianism. Joseon Confucianism is simplistic because it simply followed the ideas of Juche. Joseon Confucianism was thorough because it forced the practice of Confucianist ideas on the people much harder than China did. This means that many social actions, such as caring for one's parents, discriminating between men and women, and staying at one's parents' grave for 3 years after death, were thoroughly Confucianized. Joseon itself slowly became Confucianized through this process, and the practices became a tradition by the end of the 17th century. Then, what are the principles of Confucianism? These principles, which were called 5 relationships by Mencius, are affection between father and son, righteousness between king and ministers, and functional distinction between husband and wife, seniority between the senior and the junior, and trustworthiness between friends. All of these principles were deeply influential in making Joseon into a strongly patriarchal nation. Among many religions worldwide, Confucianism is the religion that most strongly put an emphasis on patriarchal family. Patriarchal principles can be said to be filial piety and brotherly love. These principles are patriarchal as they focus on the relationship between father and son, or between elder brother and younger brother. Because of the ideologically prejudiced aspects of Confucianism, Joseon women underwent serious gender discrimination, and there is still a tendency of discrimination that lives on today. For example, until the end of the 14th century, Korean women could inherit property from their parents and maintain personal ownership of such property after marriages. They were also not restricted in going outside. However, by the 17th century, the middle point of the Joseon, women were not able to inherit anything that were seriously restricted in going outside their home, especially women of the nobility. Although these restrictions have disappeared on the surface by now, we can still glimpse traces of it. For example, it is still the trend for sons to inherit more than daughters, and most Korean people do not resist against such a trend. This can most easily be seen in the political sector. Female participation rate in Korean politics is one of the lowest in the world. One can feel the influence of the Confucianism most strongly in contemporary Korean society during the holidays when Koreans go to their hometown. When Koreans' favorite holidays like New Year's Day or Chuseok, which is Harvest Festival Day, according to lunar calendar, come around, well, Koreans only like holidays that are connected to the family. Then more than half of all South Koreans head home. At this time of year, the highways become parking lots. Then why do Koreans go to their hometowns knowing that it's going to be a hard trip? Of course, they won't get together with relatives, but the more important reason lies in performing religious service to one's deceased ancestors on the patriarchal line. The services do not end with their parents' line, but are extended to the progenitor of the clan who may have lived 1,000 years ago. These services show that Korean society still moves along with the clear patriarchal principles. We look through how Confucianism alive still in contemporary Korean society. Okay, let's go on the next subject, Buddhism, the center of Korean religious culture. Now, in Korea, mountain areas amount to 70% of the whole territory. If you happen to travel to a beautiful mountain, you will undoubtedly find a temple which shows how many temples there in Korea. If Confucianism was relatively indifferent to making physical artifacts, Buddhism made many highly artistic temples and things to attract more believers. Therefore, among all cultural artifacts in Korea, 60–70% is connected to Buddhism. Among those artifacts, many are world famous. For example, Sakuram Temple and Bulguksa Temple are registered on the World Cultural Heritage of UNESCO. Buddha statue in Sakuram is one of the most beautiful Buddha statues in the world, while the Bulguksa is famous for its artistic buildings and twin towers. These twin towers are called Seokgatap and Dabotap. Here, tap means stupa, a pagoda. Seokgatap is a simplistic design and becomes a model for Korean Buddhist pagodas later on. On the other hand, Dabotap is a flowery style with more splendors, and similar designs can hardly be found in later pagodas. To put one tower of the utmost simplicity and another one with the utmost splendor together is judged to be an excellent artistic move. Among these two towers, Seokgatap is worthy of global interest in another aspect. This is because the world's oldest printed book was found inside this pagoda. Printed in the early 8th century, Buddhist scriptures were imprinted in the book by a wooden block. And bells are also important Buddhist things, and the bell called emille, known to have the most beautiful sound in the world, is in Korea now. Thus, there are so many representative Buddhist cultural artifacts in Korea. The reason why most of the important cultural artifacts in Korea had something to do with Buddhism is because the history of Buddhism in Korea is very long. Buddhism was introduced to Korea from China in 372 and reigned as the national religion of Korea until 1392. The masterpieces of Buddhist artifacts were mostly made in Shilla dynasty because Shilla was a long dynasty of almost 1,000 years. The people of Shilla were religiously so Buddhistic, quote unquote, that they believed that previous Buddha who are believed to appear before historical Buddha had lived in Shilla. One Shilla king even maintained that Maitreya Bodhisattva, the future Buddha who is supposed to come to earth after Gautama Buddha's period, showed up in his country during his reign. As the Buddhism sentiment was so high, Gyeongju, once the capital of Shilla, was peppered with so many temples and pagodas that it was once said that they looked like a flock birds flying across the sky. Of course, it is difficult to find such remnants now. However, if you are interested in how popular Buddhism was in Shilla, you can go to Mountain Namsan, a mountain south of Gyeongju, which was the most sacred place for Shilla people more than 1,000 years ago. It is said that hundreds of temples, statues, and pagodas were built on the mountain, and even now, dozens are still left and can be seen if you follow the valley. Such being the case, it is never strange to find that this mountain was registered as one of the World Cultural Heritage of UNESCO as a whole. Now, Goryeo, the dynasty after Shilla, and the dynasty which gave Korea its current English name, was also a Buddhist nation. As Korea's Buddhism culture saw its peak during the Shilla dynasty, Koryo's Buddhism culture is relatively low in creativity compared to that of Shilla. However, some artifacts of Koryo's Buddhism cannot be overlooked, like Koryo Tripitaka and Jikji, both registered in the UNESCO World Heritage of Memories. Tripitaka Koreana is the highest Buddhist treasure, full of Buddhist scriptures, precepts, and the treatises of high Buddhist priests. The Koryo Tripitaka, or Tripitaka Koreana, was made after those of China, which were made much earlier than the Koryo Tripitaka. Then, why is it that the Koryo Tripitaka gets so much worldwide attention? This is because the Koryo Tripitaka is oldest Tripitaka in existence. Other Tripitakas made before were all burned and do not exist anymore. Other than this fact, the beautiful form of the letters on the wooden blocks, an excellent condition of the wooden blocks that were made in the 13th century, and the scientific structure of the building sheltering these blocks are also mentioned. Jikje, this is a shortened name of a book. Well, the full name of this book is too long to mention. It's a Buddhist book. This book is a Buddhist book written by a high Buddhist priest of Goryeo, and is the oldest book printed by a metallic printing type in the world. This book is 78 years older than the Bible that Gutenberg printed with a metallic printing type. Although Goryeo Buddhism developed further, corruption penetrated Buddhism at the end of the dynasty, where 70%, not 17, 70% of the nation's land became the property of Buddhist monks, and this was one of the reasons for Goryeo's downfall. The Joseon dynasty, which was established in late 14th century on Neo-Confucian fundamental ideology, had to persecute Buddhism for economic issues as well. Only through confiscating the land owned by the Buddhist temples could Joseon government can restore the national economy. Buddhism was thoroughly suppressed for these various reasons, and therefore Buddhist influence over social issues began to wane. First of all, Buddhist monks were debased from the highest social rank to the lowest. Monks were no longer sages to the people, but leveled with the slaves. Moreover, laws that banned Buddhist monks from entering Seoul, capital city, were created and enacted, forcing Buddhist temples to move to the deep in the mountains. That is why majority of Buddhist temples in contemporary Korea are now found in deep mountains. Due to exhaustive persecutions by Joseon government, Joseon did not produce significant Buddhist thinkers or cultural set. That does not mean, however, that Buddhist monk of Joseon remained dormant. They were the most distinguishable when the nation was suffering from foreign invasions. At the end of the 16th century, Japan made a large-scale invasion in Korea over 7 years. In the foremost defense line stood troops composed of Buddhist monks. The monk soldiers were courageous and also had excellent diplomatic negotiation skills. For instance, an eminent Buddhist priest, Samyeongdang, led the Korean delegation in signing the armistice with Japan. The fate of Joseon Buddhism conformed to the destiny of the Joseon dynasty. It is because Joseon Buddhism was devastated by the Japanese imperialism as the dynasty was. Joseon Buddhism, which had already been dying at the moment, underwent rigorous liquidation process by the colonial government. Japan succeeded in Japanizing Joseon Buddhism. So, by end of the Japanese colonial rule, absolute majority of Korean Buddhist priests for whom the marriage had been outlawed were married. This is an obvious influence of Japanese Buddhism, in which celibate monks were rarely found. This is even true now. After the independence, Korean Buddhism won liberty, but had to go through years of conflict and disintegration. The biggest obstacle was struggle for power between the married monks and non-married monks. After long years scrambling, the non-married monks won, but the feuds left Korean Buddhism a hard blow to its development. The military dictatorship regime's policy to tame religious circles contributed greatly to the feuds within religious groups as well. The Korean Buddhism circles, rather than resisting against the dictatorship, decided to connive with it. The Korean Buddhism was so corrupted that only a few people could imagine the resurrection of the Korean Buddhism even until the early 1990s. However, as waves of democratization swept Korean society, calls for reform in Korean Buddhist spheres were intensified, and monks who had sided with the political power were expelled. So as a result, progressive Buddhist priests came into power, and this new leadership laid the groundwork for the resurgence of Buddhism in Korea. Many associations and groups of devotees were established, and the number of believers in young generation has been on the rise recently. Buddhist monks do not reside merely in the mountain, but come out to the secular world to participate in solving the problems of the contemporary Korean society, such as ecological issue and or human rights. Some even say, thanks to the earnest effort of Korean Buddhists, that the increased rate of Buddhist believers surpassed that of Protestantism now. Korean Buddhists seems to make a great effort to adapt them to the modern world. Now, Korean Buddhism is slowly recovering to match its glorious days. A defining characteristic of Korean Buddhism is its liveliness. Compared to Chinese or Japanese Buddhist priests, Korean priests seems to have more eagerness and vitality. Only a few young Chinese, Japanese people renounce the world, abandon everything they have in order to sacrifice their youth in search of spiritual awakening, which is enlightenment. On the other hand, there are still many young Korean men and women who are willing to join the priesthood for the purpose of getting enlightenment. The Korean Buddhism has unique features in terms of still keeping the ways of training and ceremony which were imported from ancient China, maybe Tang China. It looks that Korean Buddhism has a bright future. All right, now we are all can slightly understand what Koreans' religions are, except shamanism, which is the root of Korean culture. This is our last theme to talk today. Well, due to wrongfully directed education, most of Korean people regard shamanism as a superstition. However, whenever they are faced with troubles that are beyond their control, such as employment or marriage problems, they immediately turn to shamans for help. Here, shamans become psychic counselors. Koreans are most ignorant of the fact that shamanism is the root of their religion and culture. Moreover, it seems that Koreans are not aware of the fact that shamanism dates back as early as the beginning of Korean history and have continued to exist until this day. Koreans have an outstanding music and dance tradition such as hanjo, which can be translated as scattered music, pansori, and salpuri dance, but it is hard to believe that they do not acknowledge that such traditions originated from shamanism. These music and dance, which have been appreciated worldwide, is the most Korean amongst all other forms of culture. Argument that shamanism has always been closely linked with the history of Korea is based on the fact that Dangun, the legendary founder of Korea, was a shaman. Also, the earliest kings of Shilla kingdom from mid-1st century BC are thought to be shamans as well, since it was the era of the theocracy where one person performed the duties of a political leader, king, and religious leader, priest, at the same time. However, as the higher religions such as Buddhism and Confucianism began to be introduced to Korean peninsula from China, shamanism disappeared from the center stage of the history to the undercurrent. Buddhism, thanks to its peaceful and harmonious nature, did not have any hostility towards other religions. So until late 14th century, shamanism continued to prevail without particular obstacles. However, Confucianism, one of the most exclusive teachings of the East, which even renounced a world religion, Buddhism, as pagan doctrine, and did not hesitate to persecute Buddhists, couldn't leave shamanism alone either. Shamans, to the eyes of the Confucianists, were only misleading people by bringing wicked spirits and ghosts. Therefore, Joseon government pressured shamans both economically and psychologically by levying taxes and socially isolating families where shamans come from. Nonetheless, common people constantly turned to shamans for advice, and even queens held shaman ceremonies on regular basis. The shamanism had no problem in surviving through the Joseon dynasty. Since shamanism maintained intimate relationship with commoners, shamanistic features could be noticed in all aspects of common people's livelihood. The fate of shamanism was again at peril during the Japanese occupation of Korea. During the colonial rule, Japanese tried to eradicate everything that was related to Korean traditional culture. Shaman ceremony, which is the authentic Korean religious ritual, was of course the main target of suppression. It was, however, after independence that shamanism got a mortal final blow. The dictator in modern Korean history, Park Chung-hee, effaced folk religious practices in agricultural villages. The modernization that he had pictured in his mind was to blindly follow the Western culture and village religious ritual represented by shamanism was the first thing to be blotted out. As a result, totem poles and the shrines of a tutelary deity were almost completely vanished from the Korean villages. Even if this was true, it was too hasty to conclude that shamanism was completely eradicated in Koreans' life. Shamans who concealed themselves in the suburban areas continued to give shaman ceremonies in mountains. Shamans could keep themselves in existence because the people needed them. When Koreans are faced with troubles that they find hard to bear, they seek advice from shamans who read their minds very well. In fact, it is hard for someone to go to Buddhist or the Christian priest and ask for help on issues of adultery or slump in business. Shamans suggest certain ways to solve the problems. Whether the solution that shamans give are right or wrong, their advices guarantee of psychological comfort and stability. So shamanism, which had always sided with the commoners, expanded rapidly in contemporary Korean society. All these examples show the rise in shaman social rank. In nationwide daily newspapers, in the bottom of the 1 to 2 pages, there are fortune-telling advertisements printed by 20 or 30 shamans. Considering that it costs more than US $10,000 to have an advertisement at the bottom of the newspapers, and that shamans are able to afford that amount of money, we can predict how many people in Korea consult shamans. Koreans are known as heavy drinkers, and they are also famous for their love for singing and dancing, which are the key elements of the shaman rituals. In my understanding, Koreans' fervor for alcohol can be explained as a desire to go back to the spontaneity of shamanism at night after living in a rigid Confucian lifestyle during the day. drinking alcohol is the best way to go into ecstasy for ordinary people. Koreans who are obsessed with speed invented numerous fun ways to reach the stage of ecstasy quickly. The representative invention is bomb cocktail, 폭탄주, which is called Boilermaker in English. After alcohol intake, what comes next is singing and dancing. Korea is noticed for widespread of noraebangs, which is singing parlor or karaoke room. It is not hard to find noraebangs wherever Koreans are there, all around the world. There are numerous examples of shamanism aspects that can easily be noted in everyday life. One good example is revival services in Protestant churches. The ambience created in revival services is so fervent, and ability to talk in tongues is regarded as a very important task in order to reach ecstasy. Because of its franticness, one theologian named revival service a Christian gut. Here, gut means a shaman's ritual. Through this, we have observed that shamanism is not a primitive religion that only existed in the past, but it still has a significant influence on contemporary Korean people. Now, conclusion. Well, until now, I have listed and briefly examined religions that shaped the minds of the Korean people and the Korean culture. Korean academia has long asserted that Korean religious traditions are based on Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Strange enough, the scholars, following the example of China, avoided mentioning shamanism as the basic element of traditional Korean religious culture. There are other religions that I have excluded from this article. Among them, Taoism, Cheondogyo, which is a religion of the heavenly way, the One Buddhism, and lastly, Munseonmyeong's Unification Church. Well, I believe that it would be better to talk about religions not covered here in another article under a different theme. Thank you.